Hello all and welcome to Dissemination Day episode 17, where we are going to be discussing a topic that I think is really relevant for just about all of us at the moment. Given the current situation, PBS UK have taken the decision obviously to keep all our staff safe and the individuals that we work with safe. So where at all possible, we are working from home, and that is pretty much 100% of it right now. This has presented some unique challenges for us in terms of how we continue to support families and organisations and groups that we work with. So this topic just seemed to come supernaturally. Telehealth is something that I have been hearing about for a little while. The researchers behind the paper that I'm talking about today are both, all three are from Queen's University Belfast, which is where I was studying. So I have met these guys before, but I will be honest, I hadn't read their research, and now I have. So we're going to be talking about a paper about telehealth, which is how we can continue providing behaviour support services remotely. What some of that in research looks like, and I will walk you through it. The paper that we are discussing is this one here, which is Telehealth as a Model for Providing Behaviour Analytic Interventions to Individuals with Autism Spectrum Disorder, a Systematic Review. And this is by Jenny Ferguson, Emma Craig, Katerina Dounavi from Queen's University Belfast. Particularly, they are talking about innovative models for delivering behaviour analytic programmes, and when they wrote this paper I don't think they were considering a global pandemic as being one of the reasons that this might be required. They were more discussing the lack of professionals available, how people who live in more remote locations access these kind of services, but now I guess that they are finding their research is more relevant than ever, and they were also looking they talked about the fact that although reviews of telehealth existed, they weren't sufficiently focused on behaviour analysis. So they talked about studies that were related to diabetes or haemophilia or other medical health conditions. They were arguing there was limited evidence behind telehealth as a model for behaviour analysis specifically. So that is why they wrote this paper. So what is telehealth? They have defined telehealth as the use of communication technology to assist in education and treatment of health-related conditions. Specifically, this often uses facilities such as video conferencing for remote training or supervision or coaching. And like I said, it's been used for a number of medical health conditions already. They talked about the fact that telehealth is potentially viable because 88% of all people in the UK accessed the internet at some point within the last 3 months, and that statistic came from the Office of National Statistics in 2016. I would be really surprised if that wasn't even higher now, and further support their argument for the use of telehealth. Then in their rationale, they further outline some of the benefits of telehealth, which they include can reduce costs by up to half. That makes perfect sense if you're not having to travel or take time to travel. They additionally talk about how this is viewed favourably by those living in rural communities, and I think this does make a lot of sense because not all families are able to travel to come and see us. Not all families really want people in their houses all the time, if they can avoid that, and some families really struggle to make these approaches fit around their daily lives. So if they've got to be at work during the day and practitioners are only available during the day, that means taking time off work, etc., etc. Maybe remote approaches can really ease some of the difficulties in that area. The methodology that they used was a systematic review, and in case anybody doesn't know what that means, it means that they aren't doing their own individual research. What they are doing is taking the time to go through all of the existing research on telehealth and synthesize that into one paper that analyses what the people did, whether or not it was effective, what the kind of quality or robustness of those individual studies were, and makes generalised recommendations about the intervention on the back of that. Now, I am not an expert in any way about systematic reviews. I have written one and I have one published, but I had a lot of help back then in figuring out how to do a systematic review. So I will describe to you what they did, but in very general terms. So this isn't a great criticism or a critical analysis of whether or not their systematic review was methodologically sound, although from what I can tell it was. They used a PRISMA approach to the systematic review, which is a model for applying systematic reviews. It's the same one that I used, and I believe it is very sound and very well thought of. They used 4 specific databases to conduct their systematic review. They used ERIC, Medline, PsycInfo, and Scopus, which are 4 big ones that contain a lot of papers that should, in theory, give them a really wide scope for all of the papers that exist out there. And if a paper exists on telehealth, then it should flag on one of those 4 databases. They used a number of search terms in their screening, which they have outlined in their paper. Those included autism or ASD or Asperger's or PDD-NOS or developmental disability, etc., etc. So a very wide range of search terms that again would further the chances that any papers that were relevant to their search are going to flag as part of this process. Once they had completed that search, so they have ended up with a large number of papers because of that search, they initiate the screening process, and they screened by a number of categories, including title, abstract. They removed the duplicates. They then conducted a full text screening and did a reference search, and I'm going to give you more information on how they did that in a second. They had a number of inclusion criteria, so that meant that in order to be included in this paper, the research that they were looking at, the journal article that they were looking at, had to achieve a number of things. It had to be a peer-reviewed article, which means that other researchers have looked at it and considered it a sound article. This is a good standard. It has to be talking about telehealth as the primary mode for delivering the intervention. It has to include a 2-way communication system, so that basically means that they weren't looking at one-way training systems. They're not looking at training where you jump on YouTube and listen to somebody talk for a couple of hours. It's got to have a dual mode of communication. And at least one participant in the research has to have had autism, and we have to be able to discern their results or the outcomes of their intervention separately from the general population. So if a research article included 7 kids who did not have autism and 1 child who has Asperger's syndrome, and their results were reported collectively, then that would not be included, because we would only be interested at this stage in the results for the 1 child who had Asperger's syndrome. It had to have a quantitative data collection, and finally it had to be written in English, which seems fair. So figure 1 in their paper demonstrates the PRISMA diagram, which is a flowchart that shows you how they got from the total number of papers that were highlighted in their first search to the number that they included in the study. So first of all, their big wide search identified n equals 409, so 409 papers that might pertain to the use of telehealth for the delivery of behaviour analytic services. You can then see that when they looked at all of those papers, 53 of them were removed because they were duplicates. So that was that, they had ended up in the search twice. Once the duplicates had been removed, they remained with 356. Of those 356, they read the title and the abstract of all 356 of them, and they removed 316 of those because the title and or abstract identified that it actually wasn't quite what they were looking for. That left them with a total of 40 papers, and when of those 40 papers, you turn to the back, you go to the reference section and you review all of the references of those papers to see if any further papers come up that you might have missed. They did that, and they came up with 17 papers. They then read the full text of all of those 40 plus 17, so 57 papers in full. When they read the full text, a further 29 of them turned out not to be to meet the criteria for inclusion, and that left them with a total of 28 papers that form the basis for this systematic review. So it's actually very logical when you follow it through. So they reviewed each of those 28 papers according to a number of characteristics, including research design. So what was the methodology? Was it a single case design? Was it a comparative, like an ABAB design? Or was it a group study? Or was it, that kind of stuff? They assessed the participants, so who, not just the individuals with autism, but who was delivering the intervention, so who was facilitating on the other side of the remote delivery. They assessed what technology was used, the dependent variables, so outcomes, And finally, the aims of the study. And the last bit that they did was they assessed the research quality for each of the individual papers in order to be able to indicate rigor. I should point out that there was a lot of quite in-depth analysis in this study, and I really am distilling it down to the basics so that we can fit this in within a reasonable period of time. And one of the parts that they analysed that I was really interested in was the type of intervention being delivered. So they looked at what was the behaviour analytic intervention that was the focus of this telehealth paper. And for 43% of those, they were looking at a functional analysis with a functional communication training element. That's a huge number, and actually I was really pleased to see that, because we're trying to do a number of those at the moment, and we are, it's going quite well, but I'm going to go and find those N equals 12 papers and see what they can add to my own delivery of functional analysis or assessment over telehealth. 7% of them reported behaviour support, including positive behaviour support. Another 7% described comprehensive interventions, so that was general behaviour analytic approaches, describing the process of behaviour analysis, the concepts of reinforcement, I think, and that kind of thing. Another 7% focused specifically on teaching preference assessments remotely. And finally, 36% were describing naturalistic interventions, so sort of naturalistic or incidental teaching. Interestingly, the authors pointed out that discrete trial training and functional daily living skills training weren't a part of any of the papers that they found. So if anybody's out there looking for a research area that is untouched as of yet, or at least in a way that met the requirements of the systematic review, those are two areas that potentially would be ripe for research. Okay, on to results. So a total of 293 interventionists were trained across studies, providing interventions to 307 individuals. That's a really large number of people in my mind. So that's great. Even better is that 100% of those studies reported improvements of some kind. So that means that every single participant saw improvement on at least one domain or one outcome that they were looking at. And that really kind of says, something important about, can telehealth work? Yes, it absolutely can. Is it working on every single variable? Maybe not yet. So there's obviously some improvement or refinement in processes, but then there isn't necessarily improvement in every single variable in face-to-face interventions. That is part of the process, is about going back and figuring out why those outcomes aren't being achieved. So I think that's just overwhelmingly positive. 61% of studies had positive outcomes for all participants across all variables, meaning that there weren't areas that didn't improve. 61% of studies were successful across all variables, and that is just absolutely massive. There wasn't a single study was rated as negative, which is just fabulous. 71% included an initial training period. Now, I thought that was really interesting, and they actually cited a paper that's by Dounavi et al. I wonder if that's Louise Den, I'm not quite sure. I didn't look, maybe I should look now. Have a see. Yes, assessing competencies in applied behaviour analysis for tutors working with children with autism in a school-based setting. So they cited that paper as having recognised that initial training is a really key component in achieving procedural fidelity. So when we're designing our remote training delivery, I think that that focusing on an initial training period is going to be something that everybody really needs to think about. Unfortunately, quality ratings were low overall. Now, when I'm talking here about a quality rating, they have assessed each of these papers according to a predefined set of criteria to determine whether or not the research rigour is of a sufficient quality. And there's a number of reasons why people might score low for research quality, including things like simply not reporting ages and sexes of their participants. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the intervention being delivered was of low quality, it means that the research was of low quality. And whilst that's disappointing, I think it's really important that we don't take that away as suggesting that telehealth doesn't work in any way, because that's not correlated as directly as some people might think. Okay, so some key takeaways from this paper. Telehealth can be an effective platform for behaviour analysis, and although I think we already knew this, I had never really considered using telehealth much in the past. You know, we've done phone calls and things and initial assessments over Skype and so on when needed, but our preferred method for working has always been face to face. You know, we get in there and we do this with you. And I think that whilst that's always been our preferred method, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the only way. And this is going to be a really interesting process of adjustment for a lot of us. And it's so reassuring to know that there is a good volume of evidence out there supporting how we're trying to do things and supporting the integrity of the processes that we're now trying to implement. And I know that everyone's kind of in the same boat around that. We have transferred all of our training into webinar format now, and we're conducting functional assessments via Skype or Zoom, or we have our RHYMES program, which is our data collection program, that obviously is going to be a huge help through this process, but it's just going to be a really interesting learning curve. So I am so reassured by some of the evidence that exists out there already. Researchers have effectively translated proven face-to-face training techniques onto a telehealth platform, including, and I should have probably put its own bullet point here, including competency-based training, and behavioural skills training, and they're referenced a couple of good papers from that. We'll maybe find one to do for a future Dissemination Day. But not being there in person does not mean you cannot train people properly. And finally, unfortunately, it wasn't possible to isolate the most successful training components. So they weren't able to say necessarily that functional communication training is more successful than naturalistic teaching or incidental teaching. They weren't really able to do a component analysis, which I think will be a natural progression of research in the future. You know, which elements are working the best. You know, if I'm delivering remote functional assessment or I'm delivering a remote behavioural intervention, which of the different behaviour analytic processes have the most evidence behind them? That would be useful to know, but we're not at the stage of knowing that yet. So, in summary, telehealth can work. In fact, there is some fantastic evidence behind it achieving outcomes for people, not just for training, but also for functional assessment and more direct intervention styles. I think that it's really encouraging for those of us who are trying to adjust under light of the current circumstances. And if you are receiving, if you did have a behaviour analyst working with you directly, or if you are an organisation who has a positive behaviour support team or something like that, we don't need to throw it all out. We don't need to panic. Like, there is so much that can be done in a more creative remote delivery style, which is great. We will be looking further at telehealth over the course of the next few weeks. Hang in there and see what the next paper is. If there's anything you particularly want to hear, then you let us know. Okay, bye-bye.